Story 1: The Lighthouse Without a Keeper. In a corner of the world where maps gave up and fog lingered even in summer, there stood an ancient lighthouse called Wren's Watch. For generations, it kept its lonely vigil on the rocky cliffs of an unnamed coast, blinking its soft golden light across the Black Sea. But now it had no keeper. The last human soul who tended the tower, Old Man Calder, had quietly passed during a moonless night. He'd simply gone to sleep in the chair beside the hearth and never woken. The village below held a simple ceremony. There were murmured toasts and salted bread, and they waited weeks for the lighthouse to go dark. It never did. Long after Calder's passing, the beacon still glowed, not with the sharp, automated brilliance of a modern bulb, but the same warm pulse it had always given, rhythmic, gentle, deliberate. Some said it was residual energy, a glitch in old wiring. Others believed Calder's soul had fused with the tower. But those were speculations whispered during tea and weather complaints. In truth, the lighthouse had simply become aware. It had watched Calder for 43 years, heard his footsteps on the spiral stairs, the creak of his chair, the scratch of his pen, and the low hum of the songs he sang when cleaning the glass. It had memorized his patterns, his rituals. When Calder died, something remained in the walls, not his ghost, but his rhythm. And so, Wren's watch kept turning. Birds would come and nest on the railings, as they always had. A fox had taken to sleeping at its base, curled like a comma in the grass. At night, when the waves crashed against the cliff, the lighthouse blinked and blinked, an eyelid refusing to close. One stormy evening, a ship came close to wrecking on the reef, but the steady eye of Wren's watch guided it safely away. The captain, old and half-drunk, swore later that he'd seen a figure in the tower's top, someone tall and thin in a wool coat, watching the sea with ghostless patience. Months passed. Then, on the first night of spring, a woman arrived. Young, but not too young, worn boots, a canvas duffel, and eyes the color of sea glass. Her name was Myra. She had read about the lighthouse in a forgotten archive and come looking for a place to disappear. The villagers watched her walk the cliffside path. She never asked permission. She simply opened the rusted gate and climbed the tower. Inside, the walls were warm. Myra swept, scrubbed, and fixed the stovepipe. She sat in the chair by the hearth just as Calder had. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was to the tower, asking it where to hang her coat or whether it liked the new kettle. And slowly, she became its keeper. Not because anyone appointed her, but because the lighthouse welcomed her. It blinked a little brighter when she returned from town. The stove never smoked. Rain never leaked through the roof when she was reading. Years later, a new child in the village asked her mother why the lighthouse still had a light when no one worked there. The mother smiled and replied, "Ah, but it chooses to shine." Story 2: The book that wrote itself. In a city pressed between two rivers and a forest too old to name, there was a tiny second-hand bookshop called The Quiet Page. The shop was impossible to find unless you were lost, truly, hopelessly, existentially lost. And if you were, it welcomed you in with the scent of old ink and lavender oil. The owner was a man known only as Lynn. No one knew if that was his first or last name, and no one ever asked. Lynn moved like someone who'd long ago decided to be calm, and now couldn't be anything else. But the real mystery was Lynn. It was the back corner of his shop. There, on a lonely pedestal, sat a thick leather-bound book with no title. The pages were blank, not yellowed, not aged, just empty. Every week, Lynn dusted it, never opened it, never sold it. When asked, he would say, "It writes only for those who need it." Of course, no one believed him. One gray Tuesday, a woman named Clara entered The Quiet Page. She had quit her job that morning. She, broken off an engagement the week before. Her watch had stopped ticking. The rain had soaked through her shoes, and she had nothing left to do that day but exist. Lynn didn't greet her, he simply nodded. Clara wandered through the maze of shelves, brushing spines with her fingers. Books of forgotten authors, unread poets, unclaimed wisdom. Eventually, she reached the corner and saw the leather-bound book. Curious, she opened it. The first page now held words. In delicate, ink-black handwriting, it said, "You are not as alone as you feel, but that pain you're carrying, it's yours and it's real. Let us sit with it a while." Clara blinked. She turned the page. More writing had appeared. It told of a girl who loved maps but could never find her way, who wandered through storm after storm and kept journals she never finished. It wasn't her story exactly, but it was. Somehow, the book understood her in a way no friend or therapist or diary ever had. She stayed in the shop for hours, turning page after page, reading the slow unfolding of someone healing, slowly, without magic or sudden epiphanies, just time and kindness and honesty. When she finally closed the book, Lynn was waiting nearby with a cup of tea. "What was it?" she asked. "A mirror," he said, "of your story, written in a language only you can read." Clara came back the next week. The book had reset blank again, but this time it began a new tale of someone rebuilding one kindness at a time. Others came too. A man grieving a brother, a woman who couldn't sleep for nightmares, a tired musician. Each found a story written for them. No one ever took the book. No one tried to photograph the pages. It wouldn't have worked anyway. And so the quiet page stayed hidden, a sanctuary for the lost, the tired, the almost broken. And the book, it kept writing, always waiting for the next soul who needed it most. Story 3, The Clockmaker's Garden. In a quiet village stitched between two hills and stitched even tighter with silence, there lived a clockmaker named Ilior. He was old, but in that timeless way, like mountains or oak trees. His workshop was narrow and smelled of varnish and brass, filled with ticking from every wall, floor, and ceiling beam. But there was something strange about Ilior. He never sold a single clock. People came to admire them, intricate cuckoos that told jokes on the hour, pendulums shaped like falling feathers, a grandfather clock that softly hummed lullabies between chimes. But when asked to buy one, Ilior always said the same thing. "They're not ready to leave." At first, people thought he was eccentric, but over time, they stopped asking and simply wandered his shop for the experience. Ilior lived alone, but behind his cottage was a garden, lush and chaotic, not with vegetables or roses, but with wild, humming greenery. Twisting vines, forget-me-nots, soft mosses, even moonflowers that bloomed only at dusk. What no one knew was that this garden was where the clocks were born. Not made, born. Ilior would walk through the garden at twilight and listen. The plants spoke in tiny rustlings like old paper in wind. When he found the right spot, he would kneel, brush aside leaves, and find a fragment of time. Not metal or wood, but something crystalline, humming faintly. He would carry it to his workbench, and from it, build the clock around the moment it held. Some pieces were made from hours of joy, others from seconds of grief. Some held long-forgotten lullabies or fragments of dreams. Each clock became a living echo of a feeling someone had once lost. Then one winter, a girl named Nia arrived. She had no family, no plans, just a suitcase full of questions. She came across the shop purely by accident, following the sound of ticking. Ilior didn't speak at first. He just handed her a cup of tea and pointed to a chair. She visited every day after. Sometimes they talked. Mostly, they just listened to the clocks. One evening, Nia asked him, "Why do you keep them here? Why not share them with the world?" Ilior looked at her for a long time before answering. "They're waiting to be heard by the right heart. If released too soon, they forget what they were made for." A week later, Ilior died, peacefully in the garden. The village was quiet in mourning, but when Nia returned to the cottage, all the clocks had stopped. The air was still, the garden dormant. Then slowly, she heard a single tick. She followed the sound to the workbench. There lay a half-assembled clock and a note with her name. "Finish it, you're ready." And so she did. In the months that followed, Nia reopened the shop, not to sell the clocks, but to let people listen, one at a time, quietly, until they found the one that matched a piece of their soul. And when they did, the clock would start ticking again. Evergreen Tree Story 4, The Forest Between Days. There is a place not found on any map, not north or south, not east or west, but between. It exists only in the stillness between two breaths, the pause between days. It is called the forest between days. No one walks into it on purpose. You find it only when you've forgotten what you were doing, standing in a hallway, or staring out a window, or blinking just before sleep. And then, quite suddenly, you're there. It looks like an ordinary forest at first. Tall trees, velvet moss, a breeze that smells of pine and old stories. But soon, you notice oddities, leaves that shimmer with yesterday's light, mushrooms shaped like musical notes, paths that shift when you're not looking. One such traveler was a woman named Me. She had wandered in after a particularly long day, unsure whether she was dreaming or simply too tired to care. She walked for hours without feeling tired. Her thoughts, once loud and jagged, softened to a quiet hum. In the center of the forest, she found a bench carved from stone and moonlight. Sitting there was a creature, not quite man, not quite animal, with the kind of face you forget and remember at the same time. "Hello," it said, "you've found the in-between." Me blinked. In between what? Between today and tomorrow, between what was and what might be. She sat beside it, and what happens here? The creature tilted its head. Nothing, that's the point. You may rest here, think here, or not think at all. Time does not press in this place. And so she stayed. She did not sleep, but rested, did not eat, but felt full. She did not age, did not worry, did not strive. Instead, she watched starlight drip through branches. She listened to birds that spoke in riddles. She wrote poems on bark that glowed for only an hour. She cried, and her tears turned into dew. Then one day, though days didn't exist there, she heard a chime. A single tone, soft and perfect, as if the world itself were calling her name. She stood, the creature was gone, but in its place lay a leaf folded like a letter. It read, "You are ready to begin again." And with that, Me found herself waking in her bed. The sun had not yet risen, but something had changed. Her burdens were not gone, but lighter. Her breath came easier. Her first thought was not a worry, but a memory of the forest's silence. She got up, stretched, and walked to the window. Outside, the world waited, imperfect, unpolished, and full of days. But Me, for the first time in a long while, felt ready to meet them. The first page now held words. In delicate, ink-black handwriting, it said, "You are not as alone as you feel, but that pain you're carrying, it's yours and it's real. Let us sit with it a while." Clara blinked. She turned the page. More writing had appeared. It told of a girl who loved maps, but could never find her way, who wandered through storm after storm and kept journals she never finished. It wasn't her story exactly, but it was. Somehow, the book understood her in a way no friend or therapist or diary ever had. She stayed in the shop for hours, turning page after page, reading the slow unfolding of someone healing, slowly, without magic or sudden epiphanies, just time and kindness and honesty. When she finally closed the book, Lynn was waiting nearby with a cup of tea. "What was it?" she asked. "A mirror," he said, "of your story, written in a language only you can read." Clara came back the next week. The book had reset blank again, but this time it began a new tale of someone rebuilding, one kindness at a time. Others came too. A man grieving a brother, a woman who couldn't sleep for nightmares, a tired musician. Each found a story written for them. No one ever took the book. No one tried to photograph the pages. It wouldn't have worked anyway. And so the quiet page stayed hidden, a sanctuary for the lost, the tired, the almost broken. And the book, it kept writing, always waiting for the next soul who needed it most. Story 5, Rain on the Rooftops of Elsewhere. In a town that didn't quite belong to any country, nestled in a soft curve of hills, it rained almost every day. Not the heavy, angry kind of rain, but the gentle kind, the kind that made rooftops sing and windows glow a little warmer. The people there had long grown used to it. They carried umbrellas like accessories and wore boots even to weddings. But more than anyone, the rain was loved by a woman named Lyra, who lived on the top floor of a crooked apartment above a tea shop. Lyra had a very particular job. She collected the dreams that fell with the rain. It was not a metaphor. When the rain began and the rooftops grew glossy and blue, dreams would come with it, small, silvery things like floating thoughts or whispering bubbles. Most people never noticed them, too busy hurrying beneath umbrellas or staring at their feet. But Lyra did. She would sit by her window with a wide-mouthed glass jar and let the rain-slicked dreams drift in. Some were bright, glowing golden like the laughter of children. Others were soft green, shaped like forests or forgotten songs. And a few were heavy, blue and pulsing with sorrow, the kind that needed gentle handling. Lyra didn't keep them for herself. She would dry them with a clean cloth, store them in small labeled bottles, and once a week visit the memory market, a secret space beneath the public library, open only when the clock struck 13. There traders sold second chances, polished regrets, unfinished lullabies, or the scent of someone long gone. Lyra never charged for her bottles. She only asked one question to each visitor: what would you like to remember tonight? Sometimes people chose a joyful dream, a moment of pure peace. Other times, they needed closure or forgiveness or even just silence. Lyra always gave them exactly what they needed, even if they didn't know it yet. No one ever left her empty-handed. Then one winter, the rain stopped. No clouds, no mist, just long, dry days that felt too loud. Lyra waited. She checked the sky each morning. Her jars sat empty, her windows dry. The townspeople began to fidget. Their sleep grew restless. The memory market dimmed. Even the tea shop downstairs began offering stronger brews, as if trying to wake people from something they couldn't explain. And just when hope began to curl in on itself, it rained again. But only above Lyra's apartment. A single storm cloud, stubborn and silver, hovered over her rooftop. The rain poured like music, and with it came a flood of dreams more than ever before. Gold ones, green ones, sorrowful blue ones, and even a rare lavender dream, which no one had seen in years. She worked all night, collecting, drying, bottling. And the next morning, the entire city felt softer, lighter. No one knew why the rain had returned or why it had chosen her roof, but everyone quietly agreed that something essential had been saved. And Lyra, with her windows fogged from steam and shelves full of bottled dreams, smiled at the rain and whispered, "Thank you for coming home." Crescent Moon Story 6, The Night Librarian. In a massive, crumbling library in the heart of an unnamed city, there worked a man named Oren who only arrived after midnight. No one saw him come or go. The security guards sometimes swore the building was empty, yet every morning the books were freshly dusted, the candles trimmed, and new volumes shelved, volumes that had never existed before. You see, Oren was not just a librarian. He was a collector of unread stories, the kind people dreamed of writing but never did. When the city slept, he wandered its streets unseen. He drifted through apartments and bedrooms, listening for the flicker of imagination. The first lines of novels never started, characters unnamed, plots abandoned to busy lives and fading confidence. With great care, he gathered them. A story about a knight who was afraid of horses, a tale of a bakery run by ghosts, a tragedy that ended with a laugh instead of a scream. Each one he wrote down in long, looping ink, binding them into the library of the unrealized. The library itself was ancient and endless, its hallways curved like thought. Books rearranged themselves, lanterns floated when needed. Silence here was not empty, but intentional, like the breath you take before something beautiful. Most nights, Oren worked alone. But sometimes people found their way to the library, not by invitation, but by accident, usually when they were lost, grieving, or staring too long at a blinking cursor. They would stumble through the library doors with eyes still half dreaming, and Oren would greet them softly without surprise. "Would you like to read something you almost wrote?" he would ask. The visitors would nod, unsure how they got there or why their hearts were beating so loud. He'd guide them to a quiet chair, summon a book that should have never existed, and place it in their hands. And as they read, something would settle inside them, a kind of peace, not because the story was finished, but because it had been heard. Some returned night after night. Some left and finally picked up their pens again. And some never remembered the library at all, only a vague warmth, like a dream of being understood. Oren never minded. He had time and he had stories. And as long as there were unwritten tales floating above sleeping heads, he would keep collecting, one heartbeat at a time.